Today we're going to look at the tissues. So tissues are groups of cells working together. They will have a common embryonic origin and they function together to carry out specialized activities. A single cell can only do so much by itself, so if they group together, they're able to do more work. So they can range from being hard like bone, semi-solid like fat, or liquid like blood. Histology is the science that deals with studying tissues, and that is going to also have a field, pathology, that is going to look at the cells and tissues to see what has gone wrong with them to make a diagnosis. So there's four main types of tissues that we have in the body. Epithelial tissues are going to cover surfaces. They'll also form linings on hollow organs and body cavities, so inside your heart, inside your lungs. They'll form ducts and then also form glands. Connective tissues are going to provide protection, support, bind organs together. They can store energy as fat, provide immunity. They're a very diverse group of tissues. Muscular tissue generates the physical force that you need to make body structures move. They also will generate body heat. And then our nervous tissues are going to be used for communication and coordinating things. They detect changes in the body and respond by generating nerve impulses. So they'll send the message out to the various different body parts, how they're going to respond to whatever is going on in the system. So the way our tissues develop, they're going to come from three primary germ layers. We call them the ectoderm, endoderm, and mesoderm. So all of your epithelial tissues are going to come from all three germ layers. All connective tissues are going to come from mesoderm as well as most of the muscles. And then the nervous tissue is going to develop from the ectoderm. So this picture here summarizes nicely what things come from. You've got your sperm and egg that are going to form to make your zygote. That will go through several cell divisions, eventually become a gastrula. And your ectoderm, this is going to make things like skin cells of the epidermis, nerve tissue, pigment cells. Your mesoderm, the middle layer, would make things like cardiac muscle, skeletal muscle, the tubules of the kidney, red blood cells, and smooth muscle. And then endoderm is going to make the lung cells, the alveolar cells, thyroid cells, and pancreatic cells are some examples. So cell junctions are going to be where you have contact points between the plasma membranes of the tissue cells. There's 5 common types of cell junctions that we have: tight junctions, adherence junctions, desmosomes, hemidesmosomes, and gap junctions. So the tight junctions are going to have web-like strands of transmembrane proteins that are going to fuse the cells together. This will form more of a seal, so it can seal off passageways between adjacent cells. We see this in epithelial tissues of the stomach, intestines, and urinary bladder. That's what is going to allow them to actually seal off and be able to contain fluids in them. They'll help to retard the passage of substances between the cells and leaking into the blood or the surrounding tissues. So it helps to make them more watertight. Adherence junctions, these have a dense layer of plaque, which is a protein. This helps to resist separation of the cells during contractile activities. It's located inside the plasma membrane, and it attaches to both the membrane proteins and microfilaments of the cytoskeleton. So it penetrates a little deeper into the cell than just the membrane. So the transmembrane glycoproteins called the cadherins are going to insert into the plaque, and that's what's going to join the cells. So in epithelial cells, you can see these adhesion belts that will encircle the cell. Desmosomes are going to contain plaque and cadherins that will extend into the intercellular space to attach adjacent cells together. So desmosome plaques will attach to intermediate filaments that will have the protein keratin. So keratin is a really hard, strong protein. It's not quite as strong as you would have with collagen, but still significant strength. This is going to prevent the epidermal cells from separating under tension. So this will allow you to have a little bit of tension and pulling on your skin. and it will be in the cardiac muscle cells and prevent them from pulling apart during contraction. So hemidesmosomes, they resemble half of a desmosome. They don't link adjacent cells but anchor them to the basement membrane. So they'll have transmembrane glycoprotein integrin, and the integrins are going to attach to the intermediate filaments and the protein laminin that's in the basement membrane. With the gap junctions, these connect neighboring cells through tiny fluid-filled connections. These membrane proteins, the connexins, will allow a little bit of fluid to go in so there can be some communication between the cells. The plasma membranes of the gap junctions are separated by really narrow intracellular spaces. So this will allow communication of the cells within the tissues. Things like ions, nutrients, waste, chemicals, electrical impulses can travel through the connexins from one cell to another. So with epithelial tissue, it's going to consist of cells arranged in continuous sheets. They might be one layer, they might be multiple layers. The sheets are closely packed and held together tightly. These are going to cover surfaces of the body and make up linings, so there will generally be a free surface. There's three major functions that go with epithelial tissues. They form a selective barrier that will regulate what goes in and out of the body. They'll have secretory surfaces that can release products into the free surface, and then protective surfaces to help protect what's underneath against the environment. So the characteristics of epithelia, they've got cellularity, they're made of cells. Polarity, it's not reversible. The two different sides are different. They'll form attachments or have a basal lamina. They're avascular, so nutrients are going to come in through diffusion from the underlying tissue. They're not going to have a direct blood supply. They regenerate quickly. The quick regeneration in there means these are also where the tissues that are most likely to have cancers occur in them. They also have a good nerve supply to them. So the surfaces of the epithelial cells differ in structure and have specialized functions. The apical or free surface faces the body surface or a body cavity, or the lumen, which is the space inside, or a duct. Lateral surfaces will face adjacent cells. And then the basal surface is going to be the opposite of the apical layer. It will adhere to extracellular materials. So there's two main types, coverings and lining epithelium. These cover skin and some of the internal organs, and then glandular epithelium will be the secreting part of glands. This would include things like the thyroid, the adrenal, and the sweat glands. So general features. The basement membrane is a thin, double extracellular layer. It's going to serve as a point of attachment and support for anything that's an overlying tissue. The basal lamina is closer to and secreted by the epithelial cells. It will have laminin, collagen, glycoproteins, and proteoglycans. And then your reticular lamina is going to be closer to the underlying connective tissue. That will have collagen from the connective tissue cells. So here are just some examples of some different types of epithelial tissue. Here you can see some stereocilia on these. So when we classify these, they're going to be classified by the arrangement of the cells into layers and then the shapes of the cells. So we can have simple is going to be one layer, pseudostratified. It looks like it's multiple layers because the nuclei are not lined up together, but it's actually just a single layer. Stratified will have multiple layers. So then we've got cell shapes. You have your squamous, your cuboidal, and columnar. So when we look at the arrangement in layers, when there's one or more layers, that will depend on the function that will make that determination. Simple epithelium, single layers of cells. It's good for diffusion, osmosis, filtration, secretion, and absorption. Pseudostratified epithelium, they look like multiple layers because of the nuclei being at different levels. All of the cells do not reach the apical surface. And then with stratified epithelium, you've got 2 or more layers of cells. This is going to provide more protection to the underlying tissues in places where you've got more wear and tear. So cells vary in shape, and that will depend on their function. So a squamous cell, they're thin, they're arranged like floor tiles, kind of irregular shapes. This is going to be good for the rapid passage of substances. Cuboidal, they're not going to actually be squares, but they're going to be similar in height and width. They may be shaped more like cubes or hexagons, but they're approximately equal height and width. They may have microvilli. These are good for secretion and absorption. Columnar are taller than they are wide, so that's how they get their name. They can have cilia or microvilli. They're also good for secretion and absorption. And then transitional, the cells change shape, so they can range from flat to cuboidal. You'll see this in places like the urinary bladder. It allows it to stretch to a larger size and then collapse to a smaller size. So some examples of simple epithelium. You just combine simple with the name of the type of epithelium that you have. So we've got simple squamous epithelium, simple cuboidal epithelium, simple columnar epithelium. So that would be non-ciliated and ciliated variations, and then pseudostratified columnar epithelium, and there's non-ciliated and ciliated variations. So here again, you've got the simple squamous looking like the floor tiles. The nucleus is usually centrally located. They look like they're flattened ovals or spheres. So you see them at places doing a lot of filtration or diffusion. So this one here on the left is the peritoneal cavity. The other one is the serosa of the intestine. So endothelium is going to be simple squamous that's going to line inside the heart, the blood vessels, and the lymphatic vessels. So endothelium inside the heart is also called endocardium. Mesothelium is going to be an epithelial layer of serous membranes like the pericardium, pleura, or peritoneum. So both of these are derived from embryonic mesoderm, which is a little different than other epithelial tissues. So with simple cuboidal epithelium, the cell nuclei is round and usually centrally located. So glands like the thyroid, also in the kidneys, good for secretion and absorption. So here you can see them forming a duct, and that's the lumen in the center. So here's a sectional view. Again, you can see nice round nucleus. Simple columnar, oval-shaped nuclei are near the base, so they can be ciliated or non-ciliated. So up here you can see non-ciliated simple columnar epithelium. These are actually microvilli on there in the jejunum. And then here in the uterine tube, you've got some ciliated simple columnar cells in here. So the non-ciliated simple columnar epithelium, these can have microvilli on their apical surface, and goblet cells. Goblet cells secrete mucus. It acts as a lubricant and also helps to protect the inside of the digestive system. You also see it in the respiratory and reproductive urinary tracts. So in the stomach, it's important because it's going to protect it from the acid gastric juices. So these here, the big white colored ones, are the mucus producing goblet cells. So your ciliated simple columnar epithelium. So they're going to have cilia on the apical surface, places like the respiratory tract. So you do have some of the goblet cells in here as well. They're going to secrete mucus on the surface. That will help to trap inhaled foreign particles. So if it gets past the initial filtering of your mouth and nose, this would be a way of capturing the particles before they get down into the lungs. The beating cilia are going to help move the particles back up to the throat so that you can remove them by either coughing, swallowing, or sneezing. So in the uterine tubes, those oocytes will be moved by the cilia. So pseudostratified columnar epithelium. It looks like multiple layers. You can see the nuclei at multiple depths. So the ciliated cells will secrete mucus and bear cilia. The non-ciliated cells are going to lack cilia and goblet cells. Stratified epithelium. This is when you have two or more layers of cells. So we can have stratified squamous epithelium, stratified cuboidal, stratified columnar, and transitional epithelium. So what you have are several layers of cells that are flat in the apical layer. The new cells are going to be pushed up towards the apical layer. So as they move further away from the blood supply, they dehydrate, harden, and die. So they'll have a keratinized form of the fibrous protein keratin. You find these in the superficial layers of the skin. The non-keratinized form does not contain keratin, so that would be found in the mouth and the esophagus. So when you look in your throat, it's a little bit different in the mouth area, and then as you move down the esophagus. Stratified cuboidal epithelium are fairly rare. The apical layers are cuboidal. It's going to help provide more protection. So here is some examples here where you actually have the double layers of cells here, the stratified cuboidal epithelium. This is a sweat gland. The stratified columnar are also fairly uncommon. The columnar cells are in the apical layer only. The basal layers have a shortened irregular shaped cells. Going to provide protection and secretion. So this would be in an esophageal gland. So transitional epithelium, this is only found in the urinary system. So that's an association you want to put together. Urinary system, transitional epithelium. It's a very classic test question. It's got a more variable appearance. So in the relaxed state, the cells are going to appear cuboidal, but when they stretch, they're going to become flattened and appear squamous. So you've got to look at more than just one of the cells, but this will allow a hollow structure to expand, which is what your bladder needs to do as it fills. Glandular epithelium is going to be derived from epithelial cells that sank below the surface during development to become a gland. A gland has one or more epithelial cells that will produce and discharge some type of chemical. So the secretions, commonly called hormones, are usually going to diffuse directly into the bloodstream with an endocrine gland. They're ductless, and they're important in maintaining homeostasis. There's several different types of those that you'll learn about in the endocrine system. Here would be an example for a thyroid gland. Exocrine glands, the way I remember them is that they've got a tube or an exit. They're going to secrete their products into ducts, and that will empty onto an epithelial surface. So that may be lining the skin or the lumen of a hollow organ. So their secretions are going to go to just a limited area. So some examples would be your mucus glands, sweat, oil, earwax, saliva, digestive enzymes. You don't have these produced all over the body. Nobody needs to have saliva coming off their fingertips. So an example would be a sudoriferous sweat gland. So looking at classifications of the exocrine glands, we classify the multicellular glands on two criteria: whether or not the ducts are branched or unbranched, and then the shape of the secretory portion of the gland. So a simple gland duct does not branch, where a compound gland duct does branch. Tubular glands have tubular secretory parts. Acinar glands have rounded secretory parts. And tubulo-acinar glands have both tubular and rounded secretory parts. So you can see the different examples here in these pictures. So then we can give them functional classifications. Americrine secretion is going to have a product that's released through exocytosis. Aposecretion means you're going to have loss of both the product and part of the cytoplasm. So part of it is going to come off here. There's a bigger chunk. And then holocrine secretion will actually destroy the cell as it's going to make its secretions. So here's some examples of various types of glands for some merocrine glands, for saliva, mammary glands for your apocrine glands, and then holocrine would be something like the sebaceous glands. So 3 types of secretions: serous, mucus, and mixed. So looking at the connective tissue, this is the most abundant and widely distributed tissue. Going to bind tissue together, support and strengthen tissue, provide protection, insulation, form compartments, transport things, your energy reserves, carry out immune responses. Some are going to be resident, they stay localized. The transient would be things like the blood and lymph that are going to move to different areas. So it's going to have specialized cells. You'll have some solid extracellular protein fibers and a fluid extracellular ground substance. Those 2 things are going to make up the matrix, which is the material that will suspend the cells. This does not occur on a free surface. They do have good blood and nerve supply to most of them, except cartilage and tendons. With a poor blood supply, cartilage and tendons are poor healers as well. These are some examples of cell types. So a fibroblast, a blast is a cell that's going to build something. It's the most abundant cell type in all the connective tissues. They're going to secrete proteins and hyaluronin, which is like a cellular cement. It's also going to be rather slippery. Macrophages, they're a large amoeba-like cell, part of the immune system. They're going to eat pathogens and damage cells. Fixed macrophages are going to stay put in the tissue. Free macrophages are going to migrate. So when you learn about the immune system, you'll learn that the macrophages can have different names in different places. Adipocytes are fat cells. So each cell can store a single large fat droplet. Mesenchymal cells are stem cells that respond to injury or infection. So they can differentiate into things like fibroblasts or macrophages. Melanocytes, they synthesize and store the brown pigment melanin. Mast cells, these are going to stimulate inflammation after injury or infection. They do this by releasing histamine and heparin. So basophils are one type of the mast cell. These are ones that are carried by blood. Lymphocytes, they're specialized immune cells in the lymphatic system. One type would be the plasma cell, which produces antibodies. You'll learn about several other ones later on. Macrophages are phagocytic blood cells. They'll respond to signals from the macrophages and mast cells. So these would be things like neutrophils and eosinophils. So the fibers we have, collagen fibers are the most common in connective tissue proper. They're strong, flexible, but they resist force in just one direction. But you have a lot of these in tendons and ligaments. It's what gives them their strength. Reticular fibers are going to make a network of interwoven fibers or stroma. They're strong and flexible. They resist force in multiple directions. So these will form sheaths around organs. And then elastic fibers contain elastin. This is able to return to its original length after stretching. So you would have this in places like the elastic ligaments of the vertebrae. So elastin can wear out with age. So blast, a cell that builds something, clast breaks things down. Cyte is a mature bone cell. So for an example, chondrocyte would be a mature cartilage cell. So when we look at the matrix, you've got a ground substance that's going to support the cells and fibers. It will help determine what the consistency is of the matrix. The matrix can be fluid, gelatinous, or solid. It'll have a lot of large molecules. Hyaluronic acid is a thick, viscous, slippery substance. Chondroitin sulfate is a jelly-like substance that will also provide support. We can have adhesion proteins like fibronectin that will bind the collagen fibers to the ground substance. Proteoglycans are proteins bonded to glycosaminoglycan groups. They make up mucopolysaccharides, so they're long linear polysaccharides with repeating disaccharides. So the classification of connective tissue Its embryonic connective tissue would be things like mesenchyme and mucous connective tissue. Your mature connective tissues, you have loose connective tissue. It's got a looser arrangement. This would include areolar, adipose, and reticular tissues. Denser has a denser arrangement, dense regular, dense irregular, and elastic tissues. Cartilaginous ones, you've got hyaline, fibrocartilage, and elastic cartilage. Then you have bone tissue. You can have liquid connective tissue that would be the blood and the lymph. So this is just a visual showing the different types of connective tissues and some of their characteristics. So mesenchyme gives rise to all the other connective tissue. So your mucus or Wharton's jelly connective tissue is found in the umbilical cord of the fetus. So we have 5 groups of mature connective tissues. Your loose connective tissues, they're loosely arranged, a lot of cells. Dense connective tissue, it's got fewer cells, but a lot more fibers, they're denser arranged. Cartilage has a dense network of fibers in the ground substance. The cells are located within small spaces called the lacunae, and it's avascular. Osseous tissue, the extracellular matrix, is going to contain numerous collagen fibers as well as calcium phosphate crystals. So within the bone cells, the bone cells will be confined to the lacunae. And then the liquid connective tissue, your cells are suspended in a fluid extracellular matrix, things like blood and lymph. Areolar tissue, this is the most widely distributed in the body. It's going to have several types of cells and all 3 fibers. So this would be like underneath your skin here in this subcutaneous layer. So you can see you've got some cells, but lots of fibers in there. So the black fibers are elastic, the pink ones are collagen, and the nuclei are mostly with the fibroblasts. Another type is the adipose tissue. It's going to have your adipocytes, which are the fat cells. It's good for insulation and energy reserves. So we have white fat, which is your common fat, and then brown fat or brown adipose tissue. It's going to have more mitochondria, and it gets turned on when it's cold. So then reticular connective tissue, you've got the fine interlacing reticular fibers and cells. It's going to make up the stroma, the liver, spleen, and lymph nodes. It's going to kind of help hold their structure together. The dense connective tissues, dense regular connective tissue. So this would make up ligaments and tendons. So here is your dense regular. You can see it's got a neater organization to it. It's going to make strong attachment points. So tendons and ligaments, aponeuroses, which are big, broad, flat tendons. Dense irregular connective tissue. You can see it's not as neatly organized in here. It does provide strength. You'll have it in the fascia that's going to be around your muscles and other organs, the dermis of the skin. Leather is actually made from skin. That's what gives it its strength properties. Periosteum around bone, perichondrium of cartilage, joint capsules, membrane capsules around various organs, the pericardium of the heart, and the heart valves. So you can see it's up a little bit higher in the skin. Then your elastic connective tissue. You can see you've got these little elastic fibers in there that are kind of scrunched up a bit. That's what allows them to stretch. You'll have this in places like the lung tissue, the trachea, bronchial tubes, some of the arteries and ligaments supporting the pelvis and the vertebrae. It's going to allow for stretch. So cartilage is a dense network of collagen fibers and elastic fibers that are firmly embedded in the chondroitin sulfate. So the chondrocytes are the cartilage cells. They'll be in lacunae. The perichondrium is going to be the dense irregular connective tissue surrounding the cartilage. So you'll have an outer fibrous layer and an intercellular layer. There is no blood vessels or nerves except in the perichondrium. So injuries to cartilage can hurt because of that with the blood going to the perichondrium. They are poor healers. Hyaline cartilage is the most abundant cartilage in the body. It's surrounded by perichondrium in most places except the articular cartilage. It does give some flexibility and support, helps to reduce friction. This is the slippery stuff on the end of a chicken bone. So here are some more pictures of it. It's going to be a bluish-white, shiny ground substance. It's going to have fine, pale collagen fibers, a lot of chondrocytes. So this would be on the ends of long bones, the anterior ribs. So if you feel on the lower end of your rib cage in the front, you'll have it in part of the nose, larynx, trachea, bronchi. And this will make up a lot of the embryonic and fetal skeleton. So it will give smooth surfaces for movement and allow more flexibility. Fibrocartilage, the chondrocytes are scattered among bundles of collagen fibers, so you can actually see the fibers a lot more with this. They lack perichondrium, it's the strongest type. You would have this in the intervertebral disc between the vertebrae. You also have it in the pubic symphysis between the pelvic bones. So here's some more pictures of your fibrocartilage. So also the meniscus of the knee. Lots of fibers in here. Elastic cartilage. Here you're going to have the thread-like network of elastic fibers. You will have perichondrium. So they'll give strength and elasticity. So you'll have this in your larynx and the epiglottis. It's what's going to come down when you swallow things to keep it from going into your airway. Part of the external ear, so the arcle, the part that sticks out from the side of your head, in the auditory tubes. So you can see the fibers in here. Cartilage grows slowly. When it's injured or inflamed, repair is slow because of it being avascular. There's two patterns of cartilage growth. Interstitial growth is going to grow from within the tissue. Appositional growth is going to grow at the outer surface of the tissue. So bones and organs are going to be composed of several different connective tissues. We can refer to it as osseous tissue. You'll also have periosteum and endosteum. Compact bone is going to be made up of these repeating units called osteons or haversian systems. Here you can see this circle. This is it enlarged. Each of those is an osteon or haversian system. Spongy bones lacks the osteons, but it's going to make these thin columns of bone called trabeculae. So it actually looks like a sponge or somewhat like Swiss cheese. So here you can see those osteons again. So your liquid connective tissue, blood, it's going to have liquid extracellular matrix that we call the blood plasma. So here's some examples of the cells that you've got: red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. And then lymph is also going to be a connective tissue. So with the blood, it's going to be found within the blood vessels and the chambers of the heart. Its job, it's going to transport respiratory gases. White blood cells you use for your immune system, platelets for clotting. So the membranes, they're physical barriers that are going to line or cover parts of the body. It's going to be made up of epithelium supported by connective tissue. Mucous membrane is going to line a body cavity that opens directly to the outside. So the epithelial layer is going to be important for the body's defenses against pathogens. A lot of times it's going to have enzymes in there to help with that. The connective tissue layer is areolar tissue, and it's called the lamina propria. So your serous membranes are serosa, line cavities that don't open directly to the outside. They'll also cover organs within the cavity. They're going to consist of areolar connective tissue covered by mesothelium, and they'll secrete a serous fluid for lubrication. Epithelial membranes are a combination of an epithelial layer and an underlying connective tissue. These would be things like mucous, serous, and cutaneous membranes. The synovial joints are going to have their own sets of membranes. These are going to line joints and contain connective tissue, but not epithelium. Muscular tissue, it's going to be made up of muscle cells. They're elongated cells called muscle fibers or myocytes. They're going to use ATP to generate force for contraction. There's three main types: skeletal, cardiac, and smooth muscle tissue. So skeletal muscle tissue is attached to the bones of skeleton. They'll vary in length based on which muscle it is. Some are roughly cylindrical, some up to 40 centimeters. They are striated, so they have the striped appearance under voluntary control, so you do have conscious awareness and control of them, and they're multinucleated. Cardiac muscle is also striated in appearance, but it's involuntary and it's uninucleated. So involuntary, it's going to contract whether you remember to have that happen or not. That's a good thing, since you're not going to live very long without your heart contracting. What's unique to this tissue is the intercalated discs. And here you can see some examples of them. And a little bit larger, seeing the intercalated discs. So smooth muscle, this would be in the walls of hollow internal structures, things like blood vessels, airways, in your lungs, the stomach, the intestines. It's non-striated, so it does not look like it has stripes. It's under involuntary control as well, and uninucleated. So this is going to help move food through your gastrointestinal tract, contraction of the bladder, gallbladder, uterus. So some more examples of it. Nervous tissue is going to have two main types of cells. Your neurons are the actual nerve cells that do the conduction, and then neuroglia are the support cells. So they're going to exhibit sensitivity to various types of stimuli. So when we look at the parts of a neuron, the cell body is where you're going to have the nucleus and nucleolus. The dendrite is going to be the receiving end that's going to receive signals. It's going to carry them towards the nucleus. You can have short branches extending from the cell body. The axon is going to propagate the nerve signal to other cells. It's going to be the sending end. So neuroglia are the support cells. They maintain the physical structure of the tissue, helpful in repairing tissue framework after injury, not necessarily repairing the nerve cell though. They can do phagocytosis, provide nutrients to neurons, regulate the composition of the interstitial fluid surrounding the neurons. So when tissue is damaged, and it's extensive to both the stroma and parenchymal cells, those will both be active in the repair. Fibroblasts are going to divide rapidly to make new fibers, particularly collagen fiber. New blood capillaries are going to supply materials needed for healing. So all of these processes create an actively growing tissue that we call granulation tissue. Tissues heal faster in young adults. So surgery of a fetus, they generally don't end up with any scars because it heals so well. Young tissues have a better nutritional state, a better blood supply, higher metabolic rate. Extracellular components also change with age. You have changes in the body's use of glucose, collagen, and elastic fibers that will contribute to the aging process.